Simon Smiley. Carter always said that a clown's mask had two sides, one for laughter and one for hiding secrets. As Nancy Dobson stood across from Smiley at her husband's funeral, her knees weak from the realization, she finally understood what he meant. The smiles they wore today were like paint, covering scars that would forever haunt her. And the truth, the truth wasn't something she could ever bury as easily as they had Carl's body. The day began as any funeral might, somber, with the air thick from muffled sobs and muted greetings. Nancy Dobson took slow, deliberate steps to her seat near the front of the chapel, her eyes distant as she followed the wooden casket that contained her late husband, Carl. Carl Dobson, the man she loved, had spent his years as a children's party clown, entertaining, laughing, and always filling the world with cheer. The family had chosen to honor his spirit with a light-hearted memorial, a reflection of the man they believed Carl to be. So when Simon Smiley Carter arrived, all eyes turned to him, unsure what to expect. Smiley was the clown Carl had once called a colleague, a man who now wore a faded costume of mismatched colors. His once bright red nose dulled to a muted crimson. His face was painted with exaggerated cheer, a wide grin drawn almost painfully across his lips. He shuffled to the front of the chapel, nodding respectfully to the guests. His shoes squeaked across the polished floor, a jarring sound in the quiet of morning. The children, seated near the back, perked up with interest, while the adults exchanged wary glances. Nancy sat rigid in her chair, her fingers tight around a small lace handkerchief. Smiley wasn't part of her plan for today. It had been her eldest son, Thomas, who had thought a clown would be appropriate. "One last laugh for Dad," he had said, his voice cracking under the weight of loss. Nancy had agreed, even if her heart hadn't been quite sure. Smiley began with a soft chuckle, his voice carrying across the chapel. "Carl was a man of many jokes, many faces," he said, his eyes sweeping over the gathering. "He loved children, didn't he? Oh, how he loved to make them laugh." Smiley paused, a strange glint in his eyes, and for a moment, Nancy caught something there, a flicker of something far too knowing. "Carl knew how to keep secrets, too," Smiley continued, his tone still light, but there was an edge beneath it, sharp as a knife's tip. He knew how to make the children laugh, and how to keep them quiet. He let out a laugh, but it was hollow, echoing in a way that twisted the mood in the room. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Nancy's knuckles turned white as she clutched the arm of her chair. The chapel's atmosphere changed, the warmth of shared memories replaced by something colder. Thomas frowned, shifting uneasily, while Nancy's eyes locked on Smiley, her heart pounding in her chest. Smiley looked at her then, his painted smile almost mocking. "You know, Carl taught me a lot," he said, his gaze never leaving Nancy's face. "He taught me how to keep the kids entertained, how to make sure they never told anyone about our games." He winked, and this time a nervous laugh came from somewhere in the back of the chapel, someone who clearly thought this was all part of an act. But Nancy knew better. She could feel it, the weight of something she had missed, something dark curling beneath the cheerful facade of Carl's painted smile. She rose, her legs trembling, her voice barely a whisper. "What are you saying?" Smiley only smiled wider. "Oh, Nancy, don't you worry. I'm just here to celebrate Carl, all of Carl." He spread his arms, his oversized sleeves flapping. "The parts you knew and the parts you didn't." Nancy's vision blurred, her breath hitching as she turned towards the casket. The memories she had cherished twisted, turning sour, her mind filling with questions she had never thought to ask. Who had Carl really been? What had he done when the laughter stopped, when the lights went out? By the time the service was over, Nancy's world had crumbled. She cornered Smiley in a side room, her voice shaking. "Tell me what you mean," she demanded, her eyes wet with unshed tears. Smiley leaned in close, his grin fading as his painted face took on a solemn look. "Carl wasn't the man you thought he was, Nancy," he said, his voice a low whisper. "He used his charm, his act, to get close to the children, to groom them. It wasn't just fun and games. It was darker. Much darker. Nancy felt her knees give way, her body crumbling under the weight of Smiley's words. The truth hit her like a wave, drowning her in the horrifying reality of what her husband had been. Smiley stepped back, his expression unreadable. You wanted to honor him, Nancy. Well, now you know everything. You can decide how you'll remember him. With that, he walked away, leaving Nancy alone in the room, the truth like a noose tightening around her throat. She clutched her chest, gasping for air, tears streaming down her cheeks. There were no answers, no solace, only the terrible truth that Carl had hidden behind his painted smile, and the burden Nancy now carried, a secret she could never truly bury. Story 2. The laughter died before anyone even realized what had happened. A bright red balloon floated aimlessly into the air, slipping from a child's fingers as silence washed over the birthday crowd. All eyes were on Matthew Green, the clown with a smeared grin and hollow eyes, as he leaned in close to the host, the one person whose laughter he wanted to strangle. You remember, don't you, James? The car. That night, Matthew whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the backyard fountain trickling in the distance. The children, wide-eyed and confused, watched as their birthday entertainer spoke words that no one could ever imagine at a child's party. But the day hadn't started that way. No, it had all begun much more simply, with laughter and bright colors, a cheerful birthday celebration with balloons, cake, and one unassuming clown who seemed to bring the party of a lifetime. Matthew Green pulled his rusted sedan into the Hartman's driveway, adjusting the crooked smile painted across his face as he stared at the grand house before him. A part of him wondered if the mother knew, if she'd really looked at his profile before booking him, or if she was just another careless socialite who never looked past the surface. He knew the type, always caught up in their own lives, oblivious to the world beyond their manicured lawns. He shook his head, focusing back on the task at hand. It was a job, nothing more. A children's birthday party, bright, chaotic, but ultimately just an event that would end like any other. He'd put on his painted smile, do his act, and leave with enough cash to get him through another couple of weeks. That's what he told himself anyway. Lily Hartman, the mother, met him at the door with her perfect smile. Oh, thank goodness you're here. The kids are about to riot, she laughed, her eyes darting nervously toward the yard where a dozen children ran around the colorful lawn. She gestured at Matthew's oversized shoes and ridiculous red nose, barely making eye contact. He knew that smile. He'd seen it in plenty of houses just like this, polite, insincere, blind to the scars etched into the man standing before her. He followed her out to the backyard where tables lined with treats, streamers, and balloons painted a scene of celebration. James Hartman was in the far corner, standing by the grill, barely glancing over as Matthew made his entrance. The big clown show, as Lily had put it. James turned just enough to offer a nod of acknowledgement, a flash of recognition dancing behind his eyes before he looked away. Matthew's stomach twisted and he pushed it down, focusing on the task. The show started off easy, balloon animals, juggling, jokes that had the kids howling. Matthew put on his best grin, danced and moved as if he hadn't been practicing this act for years, as if it were all fresh, as if he hadn't woken up that morning feeling like today was different, like today was the day something was going to snap. Hey kids, he called out, pulling a chair from the table and planting it in the center of the yard. How about I tell you a story? The kids cheered, oblivious. Even Lily, who hovered near the back, nodded with encouragement, unaware of the storm slowly brewing. Matthew turned to the children, but his eyes flicked briefly towards James, just enough to catch the tightening of his jaw. This is a story, Matthew began, twirling the hat on his head, about a little neighborhood just like this one, and a little family just like yours. He gestured grandly, and a few of the parents laughed, but Matthew's eyes hardened as they fell on James. And do you know what this family had? They had a secret, Matthew said, his voice lowering. just enough that the children leaned in closer. He glanced at James again, saw the man's shoulders stiffen. James's eyes finally met his, suspicion written across his face. This secret was about something that happened one dark night. Matthew continued, his gaze never leaving James, when someone wasn't watching where they were going. The air seemed to freeze. James's hand paused mid-motion as he tried to turn a burger on the grill, his knuckles white around the spatula. A secret about a car, Matthew continued, almost casually, his voice carrying across the now silent lawn, and someone who never made it home. James's face drained of color. Lily, finally sensing the shift, moved forward. "Okay, maybe that's enough story time, Clowny," she said, her voice tight, her smile strained. But Matthew wasn't finished. "Isn't that right, James?" Matthew said, ignoring her, his voice dripping with venom, his painted smile stretching wide as he stepped closer. The children looked confused, a couple of them giggling, thinking it was all part of the show. But James's eyes darted to his wife, then back to Matthew, and he knew the secret was out. "Do you remember that night, James?" Matthew's voice shook, the painted clown facade cracking, the desperation clear in his eyes. "Do you remember the little boy who never made it home?" The backyard erupted. Gasps, murmurs, Lily's face a mask of confusion and horror. James stepped forward, his face twisting from fear to anger. "You need to leave," he growled, his voice low. But Matthew just laughed, a hollow, empty sound. "Not until everyone knows what you did," Matthew said, throwing his hands up, making a spectacle of it, his painted face now smeared with sweat and tears. "You took everything from me." The chaos was instant, children crying, parents grabbing their kids, Lily screaming at James, trying to understand what was happening. Matthew dropped the juggling pins, the balloon animals, every prop he'd used to bring smiles. They lay discarded on the grass, forgotten. James, desperate, turned to Matthew, his voice trembling. "What do you want?" Matthew paused, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with anger. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only James could hear. "I want you to pay. I want you to feel what I felt." James swallowed, his gaze flickering to his terrified wife, his crying daughter. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet, his eyes locked on Matthew's. "Please, take it. Just leave us alone." For a long moment, Matthew stared at him, the silence stretching between them, until finally, he reached out, taking the money. His painted smile twisted into something darker, something resigned. "Justice," he whispered, "is a funny thing." And with that, he turned, walking away from the chaos he'd unleashed, the money clutched in his hand. A hollow victory, a twisted resolution.